Hello, everyone. You are listening to Uncomfortable Truths with Euclid Phoenix, where I talk about politics, religion, and other BS that I find interesting. Let's talk religion. In this segment, I'm going to discuss what is generally known as the gap theory in the biblical book of Genesis. The gap theory states that there is a huge gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. There are different variants of this belief, as some believe that the earth was destroyed by a flood the first time before the 6 days of creation. Some even believe that it was when Satan, who created the animals during this period, allotted by the gap theory. Entire books have been written on the subject, but I'll cover it briefly here. Gap theorists believe that there is a huge gap between the first two verses of Genesis. Thomas Chalmers was preaching this theory in the early 1800s. The gap theory states that at some distant time in the past, the earth and the heavens were created. However, before we get to verse 2 in Genesis 1, a whole bunch of things happened within that gap. Some believe that this is when war was waged in heaven between Satan and his angels and God and his angels. Some believe that this was the period when such beasts as the dinosaurs ruled the earth. Then one day God destroyed the earth and remade the earth in 6 days. They use other verses to justify the point, such as 2 Peter 3:5-7, which reads, "For this they willingly are ignorant of that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, or by the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." Gap theorists often claim that there was a flood prior to the flood of Noah's ark that destroyed whatever lived upon the earth in that time. This passage makes a comparison between the heavens of old and the heavens and the earth, which are now. This argument states that Adam and Noah were under the same heavens, but the heavens of old were referring to the heavens before Genesis 1:2. They also say that with the earth standing out and in the water, it was more likely that the earth was floating on a large body of water that covered the entire solar system. This is really hard to visualize since the bottom of space has never been discovered. Genesis 2:4 says, "These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, and the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens." Given that generations are plural, gap theorists suggest that the heavens and the earth had a generation before the 6 days of creation. This theory tries to reconcile what scientists believe regarding old Earth while still believing that young Earth creationists were correct and believing that the days in Genesis 1 were intended to be literal 24-hour periods. The gap theory seems to answer a lot of problems when it comes to evolution and creation. However, like the other theories, there are problems. For example, the sun is still created on the 4th day after the gap, which puts the sun at about 6,000 years old. However, science puts the sun at approximately 4.6 billion years old. Of course, the gap theorists could say that the sun was rebuilt on the fourth day. Some gap theorists believe that the term world is used in the Bible. Let me repeat that. Some gap theorists believe that when the term world is used in the Bible, it is referring to an age upon the earth. Hebrews 1:2 says, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. Gap theorists often believe that the term world here is referring to more than one age, the age or ages before the sixth-day creation and the age after the sixth-day creation. So what about sin and death entering the world through Adam? Romans 5:12 says, wherefore as by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed all men, for that all have sinned. Being that the word world is being used, gap theorists interpret this as saying that sin and death entered this age through Adam. The ages before could have had death, but death and sin re-entered the world when Adam sinned. So what happened during the time of the first earth? Gap theorists may resort to this passage, Job 38, verses 4 through 11. Where was thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? I declare, if thou hast understanding, who hath laid the measures thereof, if foundations thereof fastened? Who had laid the cornerstone thereof, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors, when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the clouds the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and broke up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and has said, hither shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. This verse supposedly talks about the first creation, and according to gap theorists, this is when the angels inhabited the earth. Some gap theorists believe that on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars were, in a sense, resurrected on that day, and that is why we can see light from the stars so far away. They may make the comparison with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and since Lazarus still appeared his age, they believe that after being resurrected, the sun, moon, and stars would also appear their true age, as to say. Since gap theorists believe that the world was destroyed before the days of creation, they might bring up the cataclysm created by the Ice Age around 13,000 years ago. According to gap theorists, there was a flood that came, and then after that was the Ice Age. They believe that the earth was quickly frozen. The type of human that was living during the Ice Age were extinct, and modern humans are descendants of Adam. However, since we have 2% of DNA deriving from the Neanderthals, that suggests that humans bred with the Neanderthal, and therefore they existed at the same time, which pokes a hole into the idea that the Neanderthal and modern humans live in two entirely separate times. However, one of the arguments as to why there is 2% similar DNA has to do with fallen angels. In Genesis 6, 2-4, the sons of God came down and mated with human women and produced offspring. The argument states that angels could have also come in contact with the Neanderthals and similarly mated with them to produce offspring, being that the angels must have had some sort of DNA in order to reproduce. The 2% similarity actually is the DNA of fallen angels. I would say that this idea is stretching it a little, but that is the argument I came across. The idea of fallen angels mating with human women is a whole other argument which I intend to bring up when I get to Genesis 6. However, over the past 10,000 years, scientists have found that there has been an acceleration in human evolution. This could account for why there is so much of a difference between modern humans and Neanderthal. There was a time in history referred to as the Younger Dryas event, which occurred over a span of 1,200 years. It happened from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. During this time, the Earth's temperature dropped dramatically and rapidly. One hypothesis of how this started is that a swarm of carbon and water-rich comets collided with Earth. The evidence of this is that diamond particles have been found in sediment dating to about 12,900 years ago. Some proponents of the gap theory believe that this was the time period when the old human-like beings before Adam and Eve were wiped out. They state that it seems impossible for a hunter-gatherer society to quickly switch to an agricultural society. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, the people after them became herdsmen and tillers of the soil. Gap theorists often point to the sudden extinction of megafauna, which occurred around the Ice Age. Why is there global evidence of great volcanic activity in the late Pleistocene, including massive flood basalts? And why is there evidence of great tidal waves and vast animal death deposits in high mountain regions? Gap theorists often interpret that when Genesis 1:2 says that the earth was without form and void, that God would not create anything that was void, so something had to have been destroyed. Verses such as Jeremiah 4:23 and Nahum 2:10 use the same terms and both refer to destruction. They also relate the idea that the earth was covered with water during Noah's flood, indicating that the world has been flooded at least twice. God gave the sign of the rainbow to promise that he would never flood the earth again. So does that mean he used flooding more than once? What happened during the period of the gap? Some say that this is when the battle between Satan and his angels was fought against God and his angels, and Satan was cast out of heaven. Most Christians assume that the serpent, Satan, and Lucifer are all the same character. That's a whole other argument. The serpent was already in the Garden of Eden when it was made, and there is no indication of a significant battle in heaven during the making of creation. Then it makes the most sense to say that this battle and the fall of Satan happened within the gap suggested by gap theorists. However, some see that God created everything that he said that was good, indicates that Satan hadn't fallen yet. Then there is Psalm 104:30, where God renews the earth. This renewal is thought to be referring to the 6 days in Genesis. If the earth had to be renewed, that means it existed prior to the 6 days of creation. It could be pointed out that each day of the 6 days begins with, and God said, and the evening and morning were the day. However, this formula wasn't used in the first two verses of Genesis according to the gap theorists. Genesis 1:28 says to replenish the earth, and the same command was given to Noah in Genesis 9:1. This seems to indicate that the earth needs to be refilled. However, this word can also be translated to just mean fill. Both Exodus 20:11 and 31:17 say that God made the heavens and earth in 6 days. This seems to imply that Genesis 1:1 would be included in the 6 days. The gap theorist's objection to this is that the words create and made have different meanings. The word create is used in Genesis 1:1, and it means that heaven and earth came into existence. However, the word made is used in the two Exodus verses, means to make something or put it together, kind of like making cookies. Everything is already there to make the cookies. They just need to have the ingredients put together. There are problems with the gap theory. First, there is no absolutely clear evidence in the Bible for a gap theory. It seems that verses of the Bible used to be reinterpreted in order to support the gap. However, there are also no clear verses supporting the Trinity, yet most Christians believe it. There are some loops that one has to jump through in order to have the Bible say that there is a gap there. One is that the true translation of the first verse in Genesis is a singular heaven, and that in Genesis 2:1 it says heavens. It is thought that the singular heaven refers to where God is, whereas the heavens refer to Earth's atmosphere and outer space. It seems a little flimsy, but I can see how it works. 1 Corinthians 15:45-47 mentions that Adam was the first man and was the first living soul. However, gap theorists generally don't believe that a man such as Adam or modern man lived in the age when the supposed gap took place. Does that mean that these who lived during the gap were soulless? 1 Corinthians 15:21-22 mention that sin and death came into the world through Adam. This presents a problem for gap theorists, since they believe that sin and death were part of the old world before the 6 days of creation. However, they point out that the serpent in the garden, who was also in existence in the garden before man sinned, and therefore there was evil present. No Bible commentaries written before the 1700s mention anything about a gap, indicating that it wasn't something that was believed at the earlier date. This, of course, doesn't negate the idea that there could be a gap. Whether the Bible promotes a gap theory or not is debatable, and I can see where both sides of the argument are coming from. I personally think it is the best theory when it comes to interpreting the Bible in context with science, but it also has its downfalls. Thank you for listening, and you'll hear me again soon.